In this video, we're going to discuss the topic of what just went wrong. When you begin coding in Visual Basic.net, or any programming language for that matter, there are going to be things that just puzzle you. You don't understand enough about the tool to be able to diagnose the problems. As Bill Gates says, success is a horrible teacher. And unfortunately, the best way to learn is to make mistakes. I know that might not be comforting to you if you're in the midst of trying to learn. It is a frustrating experience, but you have to understand that this is all part of the process. So let's talk about what types of mistakes or different types of errors your program can encounter and how to go about fixing them and finding them. The first type of error is the design time error. That's when you type in something incorrectly. Maybe it's you type in a variable that hasn't been declared. Maybe you type in a keyword statement and you misspelled it. Whenever this occurs, you'll see a blue squiggly line appear underneath your code. And that's actually a good sign. That's the IDE helping you find what's wrong with your application. If you go to compile your application, you'll see little red squiggly lines if there's a problem. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And that comes to the next topic of compile errors. Whenever you begin to build your application, your code might look fine, but there might be other things that that come up. Like, for example, maybe the compiler senses that you're trying to add together a string and an integer or something along those lines. And so it returns back to you in the task list a list of things that's wrong with your application. And so then you're tasked with fixing those problems. These happen whenever you try to compile the application because any given line per se doesn't realize that there's a syntax error. It doesn't try to evaluate what values are in the variables or what data type the variables are to be. And that's only caught at the compile time when you actually go to the build my solution or build entire solution option. And then you have runtime errors, and these are known as bugs. These are things that are not syntax errors and they're not compilation errors, but they're problems with the logic of your application. And therefore, these are always the hardest ones to find. The compiler doesn't find them automatically for you. The IDE doesn't always point them out. These are things that you're going to have to find through diligent effort on your own part of testing your applications. Some people, or programmers rather, have the idea that, hey, it compiled, it has to work. And so if they get the application compiled and they send it out to their users, and they're in for a rude awakening whenever the users start complaining of bugs. Just because it compiles successfully doesn't mean that the application works. And so your prime directive is that you have to find and eradicate all of the bugs within your application to put out a quality piece of software. If you do find bugs after you ship the product, you can always claim that it's a feature. I'm just kidding, as you can see by the smiley face there. I have a friend who says programming is easy. It's finding all the problems that's hard, and that's absolutely true. You know, as you begin to develop applications, you're going to write some code and then you're going to test it. Really, some people have suggested that you'll spend 40% of the time coding and 60% of the time testing what you've coded. And so there's a little recommended technique that many experienced developers have, and that is you write a small section of code and then you test it, and then you write a little bit more code and test it. Get out of the mindset of typing these big, long paragraphs of code, hundreds of lines of code before you even get to the point where you can test it, because it's harder and harder to find the bugs if you take that approach. One thing that you can do in order to find bugs is that you can check for errors within your application. You can handle them gracefully, or you can expect to find errors, and when you need some kind of system or logic that handles whenever errors occur. And so Visual Basic gives you a couple ways to do this. Now, we're not going to go into them thoroughly right now, but I just want you to know that these exist. Say, for example, an error happens in your code. You can either set up a special section of code just to handle that error and maybe report the error to the user or record it in a log. Or you can, as you see in the next statement, on error resume next. It ignores the problem for the time being and maybe checks to see if there was something that went wrong 10 lines ago. You have that option as well. And there's a third option that's called try, catch, finally, which is new to Visual Basic. It's also referred to as structure error handling, and it's the preferred approach. Again, we're going to go into all of these in future videos, but just wanted you to understand that there are ways to trap bugs within your application with an effective use of trapping runtime errors. The agony of defeat. So when you encounter a problem, what do you do besides feeling hopeless and despondent? Well, first of all, I'd like to recommend that you can avoid most wild goose chases by reading the message thoroughly. A wild goose chase is when you're actually hunting down a bug that doesn't exist because you didn't read the error message as it was presented. I get a lot of email from people who ask, how do I fix this particular problem? And they'll send me the message, and they'll send me their source code, and they'll tell me what they think the problem is. And I'll say, but if you read the error message carefully, you'll see that the problem isn't on the line of code that you're looking at. The problem happened 3 lines above that, or whatever the case might be. So my first recommendation is to read the error message thoroughly and really think about what it's trying to say. Admittedly, the error messages are very verbose and yet still don't tell you a whole lot. But you still have to interpret what the error messages are saying, or at least make that attempt. The second thing that you should try to do is isolate the actual problem from what you think the problem is. So you need to try different things in your code. That might mean commenting out lines of code, getting rid of the code that isn't really part of the problem so that you can isolate the actual problem. So don't be afraid to move code around, try little test experiments within the application. I'll show you how to do all those kinds of things in future videos. But then the next thing is that I'd like to suggest you read the manual or help thoroughly. This is pretty important because a lot of the problems can be solved just by looking up a reference to a given problem. A lot of times in the ASP.NET error pages or even the Windows error pages, there'll be a little help button next to the error message, and so you'll be able to find out more information about that error and possible solutions and how you can resolve them. The next thing you can do is search diligently on the net, and there's even lists. If you go to asplist.com, you can sign up for a bunch of lists, and you can ask questions of the people there. And Charles Carroll runs the group list and does a fine job at it. So I recommend that you go there and search for and see if anybody's already asked that question. And if somebody hasn't already asked the question, or if you can't find it, then as a last resort, ask somebody. Ask somebody for help. Don't be afraid to ask somebody for help, but get all your P's and Q's in a row, as it were. Make sure that you have all of your research, that this is something you just can't figure out on your own before you ask somebody else. Because although people are more than willing to help, they enjoy helping other people, you can avoid feeling bad about yourself by spending a little more time up front and making sure you get all your facts down before you run out and ask everybody for their help. So now what we're going to do is intentionally make some things go wrong, just very briefly so you can see what to do. For example, I'm going to make the common mistake of just misspelling the word integer. Notice that keywords like data types, assignment statements, and dimension statements, and so on, even the sub, end module, these all appear in blue text. And the actual values like variables and names of methods and names of modules and things of that nature are in black text. Also notice that when you type in the word integer and it doesn't show up in blue, but rather it shows up in black, and it has this blue squiggly line underneath it, that means you've got a problem that you need to address. Because I'll try to go and build solution, and you'll notice that it says type integer is not defined. So I'll double click it and it'll show me exactly where the problem is, and I say, oh, I didn't spell it correctly. There we go. The next thing I'm going to do is break the application in a way that will make it by the compiler, but will produce bugs in our application when we go to run it for the first time. So what I'm going to do is go to string plus Steve. Okay? So I'm basically trying to set an integer value of y to x, which is converted to a string, and then add that to the word Steve. Now, this should blow up the application, but the compiler doesn't catch it, because I'm going to build a solution that says 1 succeeded. And now we'll try to run the application and see what happens. Notice that we get this Error. Unhandled exception of type system.invalidCast exception occurred in Microsoft.visualbasic.dll. Additional information cast from string oSteve to type integer is not valid. So again, you might say, wow, your head's spinning. What does all this information mean? Well, take a look at what it's really saying, that you have an unhandled exception. That means you have a problem that you did not handle in your code. The exception has a type called invalidCast exception. So you need to be familiar with some of the vernacular. A cast means you're converting one data type to another, which doesn't always work depending on the context that it's used in. And then you have additional information. Now this is where it becomes helpful. The cast from the string oSteve. Why is this oSteve? Well, if we take a look at our code and see here that x is integer, we never initialized it, so it is the value of 0. So it took the value of 0 and concatenated it to Steve. So when they try to take this value and cast it into something that would fit into the value of y, which is an integer, it wouldn't work. It's not valid. Now what I have the option here to do is to continue the application or to break right here. In most cases, you'll probably go ahead and just break the application so you can fix your problem. Also, I want you to notice something off on the left-hand side of the screen. I'm going to pull this over just a little bit. Notice the little arrow, and if we even move our line down, notice that it highlighted it in green, the line that has the problem. And so I can hit break and it'll bring me to the actual line where we have a problem. The application is still running. I'm going to need to click the stop debugging button for it to go away, and so that I can make the changes. And just assign it that way. So this is a very brief introduction to how to handle some of the initial problems that you're going to experience as you begin to develop applications. Don't get nervous. Read the problem. In the case of what we just had, let me just get back to that and run it again. I can hit the help. And it will explain the types of problems that I may have encountered here. Well, in this case, it doesn't give me a whole lot. It says, it talks about the exception thrown dialog box. But in most cases, it'll actually give you more information about the bug that has been raised by the Microsoft development environment. So that's it for this video. I hope that you learned a little bit more about how to handle things when they go awry within your application development. Thank you.